We're good? All right. Well, let's open with a word of prayer, and then we will jump right into it. Father, I thank you that you have given us another week, another day that we can come together, we can worship you, we can examine your word, and examine our lives by it. Lord, I pray that you will take this time and make it profitable to us. Let us read your word carefully. Let any errors in my thought fall to the ground harmlessly, but let us cling to anything that is good, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So, this morning we are going to look at the seventh commandment. When God created man, he gave them a mission. His command was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Genesis 1:28. Now it is important to note that the first part of the command is to be fruitful and multiply. That is, the first part of subduing the earth is to build godly families, as we saw when we discussed the fifth commandment. Society is to expand one family at a time, and so the creation mandate of Genesis 1:28 would be impossible to fulfill without Genesis 2:24, which says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Later in Ephesians 5, we are told that marriage has a deeper significance. It points to the relationship between Christ and his church. Therefore, we can say that marriage is when a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife in order to fulfill the creation mandate by raising up godly offspring and displaying the love of Christ and his church. This means that any attack on God's definition of marriage is not only an attack on society, as we saw before, but an attack on God himself. Today, we have a government considering a bill which they call the Defense of Marriage Act. This is ironic since one of the goals of the bill appears to be to enshrine the shameful acts of Romans 1:26 through 28 into law. They are seeking to take God's institution of marriage and twist it into something thoroughly unrecognizable. It seems especially concerning that there are many who call themselves Christians who support the bill, given the fact that God has already given us a Defense of Marriage Act in the form of the seventh commandment. While the text of the seventh commandment explicitly forbids adultery, Exodus 20:14, Jesus tells us that even lustful thoughts are a violation of that seventh commandment in Matthew 5, verses 27 and 28. The Westminster Larger Catechism argues that the sins forbidden in the seventh commandment, besides the neglect of the duties required, are adultery, fornication, rape, incest, sodomy, and all unnatural lusts, all unclean imaginations, thoughts, purposes, all corrupt communications, or listening thereunto, wanton looks, impudent or light behavior, immodest apparel, prohibiting of lawful and dispensing with unlawful marriage, allowing, tolerating, and keeping of stews, another name for a brothel, and resorting to them, entangling vows of single life, undue delay of marriage, having more wives or husbands than one at the same time, unjust divorce or desertion, idleness, gluttony, drunkenness, unchaste company, lascivious songs, books, pictures, dancing, stage plays, all other provocations to or acts of uncleanness, either in ourselves or others. Now, if we look at this list, probably all of them, except for perhaps two or three, have ceased to be viewed as vices in our society generally, and are now held up as the greatest virtues you can imagine. Furthermore, as cultural pressures grow, I suspect we will find an increasing number of Christians compromising on these issues. We are going to need to gear up and put on our armor because the fight on these issues is going to come from within the church as well as from without. Now, I think it is helpful to stop for a moment and ask ourselves, how did we get here? Remember that the Westminster Larger Catechism was made at the request of the British Parliament. So how did we get from a point where the civil state requests a document to be created, like the Westminster Larger Catechism, to today, where the state practically legislates Romans 1? Or, on a more individual level, how do people get from the state of relative innocence when they are children to turning into adults who advocate for such twisted and perverse practices? I think the answer is that we start out small and eventually work our way up. We allow sin to get its foot in the door, and then we discover we cannot stop it when it comes pushing its way in. We sow the seeds of lust, and then it grows into a plant of adultery, blossoming into divorce, abortion, and other such major sins. Therefore, if we truly believe that marriage is a God-ordained institution where a man and a woman are brought into a relationship where they are lifelong companions, where sexual relationship is good, holy, and proper, and where they are to raise up godly offspring, as well as display the love of Christ and his church, then we must fight all attempts to subtly undermine that definition. We must resist all attempts to redefine marriage, manhood, or womanhood. We must not think that we can indulge in or tolerate minor infractions of the seventh commandment, but then act surprised when our culture wants to plunge headlong into the grossest excesses. We must be killing sin, or it will be killing us. Any questions thus far? I think the main idea I want to start us off with, and kind of the format here, is the idea that small sins will kind of blossom into much greater sins, especially in this area. Lolo.
Is that why you would, that's how you would argue why idleness, gluttony, and drunkenness are included in here?
Yes, I think especially, so idleness, I think they are almost certainly thinking of the incident with David and Bathsheba, because remember that passage opens up at the time when kings go out to war. David was in his house. So what is David doing? He's being idle, not doing what he's supposed to be doing, and then temptation comes. And so I think they are arguing, and I think this is a good argument, that if we are not doing things that are good, holy, and proper, putting ourselves to good work, then temptation will come upon us. It may be of a sexual nature, it could be of some other nature, but I think that is what they're thinking. Similar argument with drunkenness. If you're drinking a lot, that impairs your ability to make good decisions, and so those will kind of morph into these greater sins. And I think they're rightly saying all these commandments are interconnected. Bob.
I had a question about one man, one wife. So how many wives did Solomon have?
Solomon had many wives. So we will get, later we will come to polygamy. So I'm going to punt that question to later, and if I don't answer your question, then just bring it up again.
Okay.
But yes, that is an excellent question. Any other questions before we move on? Yes.
I guess this is maybe not specific to this commandment, but just how we've been treating all of the 10 commandments so far. Would you say that, like, in the commandment itself, all these sins are prohibited? Or would you say that they're just prohibited by good and necessary consequence of the commandment?
I think I would say the commandment, okay. Well, I guess I would answer that by saying Jesus does draw a connection between lust and breaking the seventh commandment. So he seems to view it as there being a connection between the two. And I think it would make sense if adultery is just viewed as kind of the prototypical, most extreme form, or most common extreme form, and it's prohibiting the entire category. Did that answer your question, or did I just say a bunch of nonsense?
Not
I guess I'm kind of
directly.
on the fence as to how to answer that.
Okay.
Linda? I think we need to resist any type of advances of that nature. Yes. Yes, and I think it is good and proper to resist any such advances. No. Okay. Respectable ways to break the seventh commandment. We have already noted that in the culture we find ourselves in, it has basically become fashionable to create new innovative ways to break the seventh commandment. However, we should stop and ask ourselves if this attitude has infected the church as well as the culture. I think that it has. I fear that, among other things, the desire to be culturally sensitive and relevant has resulted in the church embracing all kinds of sexual immorality in forms of popular songs, movies, and fashion. Ephesians 5, verses 3 and 4 tell us that but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. I think that it would be good for us to take this exhortation and compare it to how we interact with popular culture. After all, Jesus does tell us that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:28. Well, it's different. It's different if you are intentionally involving yourself. Your intent does play a major role in these things. Yes. Yes. So, do the movies we watch, the music we listen to, and the books we read fall within the parameters of these verses? Or have we allowed the practices and pressures of the culture around us to cause us to compromise on God's standards? While pornography is widely condemned both inside and outside the church, there seems to be much more dispute about how to engage with popular level films, which are oftentimes very graphic and explicit, as well as containing many more subtle comments or innuendos. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not the seventh commandment forbids us from watching these kinds of movies. Should we abstain from watching movies where unbiblical sexual expressions are normalized or glorified? The Westminster Divines would, I think, clearly have answered the question with a resounding yes, citing passages like Matthew 5:28 and Ephesians 5. The question we need to ask ourselves is, was there a mistake in their reasoning, or has the church allowed itself to be influenced by our culture to such an extent that it has made compromises in this area? And I think You could probably argue a little bit of both, but I think largely the latter is true. I think, generally speaking, yes. I don't have enough experience. I can't verify that empirically, but yes, I suspect that is the case. Now, I will grant that there are some gray areas as to when exactly a film crosses the line. I will also grant that there are unusual circumstances where we cannot avoid witnessing violations of the seventh commandment. After all, Paul does tell us that if we were to avoid these things entirely, we would have to go out of this world. However, I think we can narrow the question by asking, is it a wise choice to amuse ourselves by watching films with explicit graphic content, or even an abundance of innuendos or crass jokes? I would argue that it is not. Christ clearly condemns lustful desires, and yet I think that it is undeniable that many of these movies are going out of their way to incite lustful desires. Even if this is not a sin that we particularly struggle with, should we not be appalled by Hollywood's attempt to normalize this kind of behavior and desensitize us to it? Should it not offend us that they go out of their way to mock the seventh commandment, to glorify the breaking of it, and to mock marriage itself? And I think it cannot be denied that these things are causing many to stumble. I think Phineas rightly was filled with righteous rage when he saw this happening in the camp of Israel, and yet I find through constant exposure to it that when I see it happening, oftentimes I simply shrug my shoulders. Any questions at this point? Well, Paul tells Timothy that sexual immorality and impurity should not even be named among you, Ephesians 5:3. It should not even be a question whether these things are tolerated or embraced among the church, nor should there be any filthy talk or crass joking. However, we know that these things were clearly taking place in some churches, given the problems that are obviously present at the Church of Corinth. And so I think we can safely conclude that Paul was telling Timothy to put a stop to such things. It stands to reason that we should be doing the same, and yet I fear we are doing the opposite when we put on a show that we know will contain these things. I have singled out movies above, but I think we can be asking the same types of questions and following the same line of reasoning for other forms of books, music, video games, and countless other forms of amusements. I think it's fair to ask ourselves, are we violating the seventh commandment when we indulge in these things? Should we really be seeking to amuse ourselves by these mediums? If in fact we conclude that we are breaking the seventh commandment, then we should probably seek out other forms of entertainment in place of these. Any thoughts or questions here? Yes.
Now, I didn't get the chance last week on, thou shalt not kill, but my experience with European visitors to Goddard is that they're appalled that while many Americans are upset with sexual content in America, that they don't bat an eye about, seeing people getting machine gunned and shot and all this other stuff. And so they would say that you're entertaining yourself violating the sixth commandment. We're just entertaining ourselves violating the seventh commandment.
I have not considered that question, but that's actually a good point. Is there a distinction that can be made? I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it. Jeremy.
One argument I've heard against that is that when it comes to sexual content, you're witnessing two people actually sinning on screen, right? There are two actors on screen that were essentially fornicating together. Whereas with violence, there aren't actual two actors sinning against each other in the violence on screen. That's not to say that all violence on screen is okay, but there is a categorical difference, I think, between the two enactments in film.
Steve?
I'd also add that you can in movies portray violence and murder in a grotesque and silly way. So I'm thinking of Quentin Tarantino films where it's blood and guts for the sake of blood and guts, versus historical films that what's the Tom Hanks one with World War II, where they Saving Private Ryan, they show the brutality of Normandy, and there is a fair bit of blood and guts, but it's not there to entertain. It's there to basically show the historical brutality of war. So I would say the latter, at least as my conscience has it now, is not sinful, whereas the former very well can be. But then that also brings up the nature of art. I don't know if your study is going to get into this, but the nature of pornography and music videos or whatnot versus going to the museum and seeing Michelangelo's David or something like that.
I didn't put that in here, so I guess I'll give a comment. I feel very uncomfortable with that type of art. There's a friend from college that we're always going back and forth on this topic. And to me, it seems like and he always argues, well, this is portraying the beauty of the human form. And I always come back by saying, yes, but that was forbidden after the fall. I don't know if that's really something you can put on display. And I'm not sure if you can separate the human sexuality from the human form. And so I feel I generally avoid the art gallery in general, but I will especially avoid that type of art. I feel like someone like Rembrandt paints beautiful pictures, and yet he does not have to go there. Why don't we go with the Dutch painters instead of the Italian ones? I guess another comment I should make is for the distinction between violence or the 6th and 7th commandment. So when I was reading through Virgil's Aeneid, they have this scene where the hero Aeneas kind of has this relationship with the Queen of Carthage, and yet the way it describes it is there's a storm, they end up in this cave, and there's kind of this pseudo-marriage ceremony happening, but then it cuts the scene immediately and spreads to kind of rumors spreading that, oh, now they're quasi-married. And so it seems like, to counter the argument, sometimes these things need to drive the plot forward of a story. You don't need to be graphic to drive the plot forward. There are ways, without too much creativity, that you can get around these things. I think with violence, we can have something similar. You can kind of get the idea of what's going on without getting very, I guess you can drive the plot forward without having blood and guts going everywhere. I find super gory things to be, I think, problematic in that, yes, are you amusing yourselves by watching people dying and thinking, wow, this is fun? So I think there's similar problems going on with both of these. Yes. And I think if a movie is glorifying things like that, that is very problematic. Okay. Any other questions or comments on this point before we move on? Okay, modesty. In Paul's first letter to Timothy, he gives him instructions about how things should be conducted in the household of God, 1 Timothy 3:15. That is, when a visitor walks into the church, he should notice these things quite quickly. He should notice that the men are not being quarrelsome or angry, but marked by prayer, 1 Timothy 2:8, and that the women are not being provocative or ostentatious in their dress, but marked by modesty. Generally, I think we would say that people are dressing in modesty either when they are dressing in a way that is particularly provocative or in a way that is being so kind of showy with expensive jewelry and clothes that kind of all the heads turn towards them. You can do this. It's a problem either way. And in 1 Timothy, he seems to have the latter primarily in mind. While I think that we can all agree that there are gray areas as to what is modest and what is not, it seems like Paul is instructing us not to push our way as close to the line as we can, but rather to dress in such a way so that no one would have any questions about the issue. A visitor's mind will not be drawn to the question of modesty at all, but rather be drawn to the fact that they will rather notice our good works and godliness. Any questions or comments on that? That's kind of brief, but
A succinct way I've heard it put as to what is a good line to follow when it comes to dressing modestly is you should avoid too much, which I think would be the ostentatious, overly expensive look. You should avoid too little, and you should avoid too tight. Seems like all in all, that kind of encompasses most of everything that shouldn't be worn in church or out in public.
Bob.
A lot of these questions come from a lifestyle, what a Christian lifestyle should look like. And as far as in the church, a lot of this isn't spoken about from the pulpit. I know that a lot of times for women, they always say that the more mature women are supposed to train up the younger women to where they're modest and they wear certain things. But a lot of these choices are lifestyles. And I think we need to some point address maybe, they always say that the divorce rate in the church is higher than in the world. And a lot of these things about coming in agreement and unity to be one flesh is a point where it's really not spoken about that much, in the pulpit.
Yeah, I think so. So I would say, I think ideally, it should be when it comes to women's modesty, it should probably be the older women. That's the ideal state, and yet, if that's not happening, I think the elders do need to come in, like they have to step in. So ideally, it'll be the older women, but yeah. And yeah, I guess that's the comment I'll make there. Oh, go.
Let me put you on the spot.
Okay.
It's so much fun. Okay, so suppose, hypothetically, I have no examples in mind, that you have a woman who's dressing immodestly in the church. How would you recommend that I, as a man, go about remedying the situation?
That is a good question. Let me think. Let's see. So I do. Now, someone once sent me this sermon and said, "This is the scariest sermon you'll ever see," and it was Albert Martin preaching on the topic of modesty, and he said. And as he gets up and makes this very direct sermon on modesty, he says, I am primarily speaking to the members of this church. We're not going to kick someone out because unless they're really crossing the line, we won't tell them you cannot come in unless. Yes. So, give me 1 second, Linda. So, he says, this is primarily for the members, and it should be that when if someone else comes in, they are going to notice that all the members are dressing a certain way, and that alone will ideally will influence them, kind of put the pressure on them. But if not, I think, how would you handle that? I think at first, wait, and then say something to, I think there should probably be an internal discussion in the church that this needs to happen. This is an issue and we need to address it.
I think it would be wise in like the very early stages to have probably the older women, like I was going to say the women first, but particularly the older women be the ones to address it first, because they probably would be able to, see her without being tempted to think about her later. And it's not saying that the men wouldn't be able to address it gently, but they would be able to address it gently at first and then get more firm as time progresses without that added temptation.
Yes, that seems to make sense. And so I guess it does depend, is this someone who's sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit, or is this something flagrant? I guess would determine, is this something we can kind of handle slowly, or do we have to handle it quickly? So there are a lot of issues, but I think, yes, ideally it would be one of the women dealing with it or saying something directly. That is true, but I think he means that in a slightly different way. As in, don't be fretting about your material possessions, what you're going to have and not have. I don't think he's meaning that in the context of questions of modesty. Jeremy.
Yeah, this might be passing the buck a little bit, but I'm thinking, in my marriage, honestly, I'm going to notice a woman her often being read much quicker than my wife is.
Yes.
It might be something where maybe I need to say, I don't know if you notice, but maybe you put it out.
Yeah.
I don't love the idea of a husband kind of throwing his wife under the bus and that kind of thing, but I think this might be one instance where that could be helpful.
Yes, I think there are many situations where a wife can tell her husband, you should take care of this problem. But this may be one of the rare few where it can go the other way. Go.
Yeah, I think I would say that if it's a scenario where the woman who's dressing immodestly is married or her father's in the church, then I would think that I would feel like, okay, I'll go to our husband or I'll go to our father, who's her head, and be like, hey, keep your daughter in line. But you use slightly different words, but more or less that would sum it up, right? And then if that didn't work, then yeah, I definitely would. It seems like it would be wise to at least, if something is said if something has to be said directly to the woman, to have at least other witnesses present.
Yeah, I think the idea we're kind of pushing at is, yes, this has to be handled diplomatically and carefully, but at the end of the day, there are at least potential situations where something has to happen. Something has to be said. Yes, Dad?
Well, Jesus also says, if your eye offend you, pluck it out. It's better to,
Yes.
okay, so so the guys have to have some self-control too. It's just not all the woman's fault.
Yes, I agree. I think there are two, there is that, and I think he does also say that these things will happen, but woe to those who are the ones who bring it about. So you can have the man sinning for indulging in it, and if the woman is being provocative, that can also be a problem. Now, it could be that she's not being provocative and that he's just sinning, or it could be that he's not lusting and she's just being provocative. You have several possible scenarios, but there's room for, there are problems that can come on from all directions. I'm sorry? Yeah, well, yes, it is a problem. A little more specific. It's a subset, I think. Okay, so androgyny. Androgyny is the term used to indicate the mixing of male and female into a type of generic human. Versions of this idea go back at least to the classical Greeks, and we see forms of it continuing on to the present day. While some may argue that we should try and eliminate all distinctions between men and women, I think that it is much more popular today to simply try and downplay those differences to the extent where we basically end up with a generic human being. I think this kind of thinking is largely summarized in the feminist slogan, "I can do anything a man can do." You can't have this distinction. I think this type of teaching, well, I think there are some legitimate points that can be made here. I think that largely this type of teaching is problematic and goes in the face of what the Bible teaches pretty clearly, where it clearly states that there are men and women and that there are serious implications in the family and in the church from those facts. The culture around us will try and get us to downplay or outright deny these distinctions between men and women. However, these distinctions are clearly mandated both by the Bible and by nature, and so we need to resist that pressure and not be ashamed to tell men to be masculine and women to be feminine. I think I do have some examples that I put in a footnote. I think John Stuart Mill, in his work, The Subjugation of Women, argues that the differences between men and women are basically just physical, and as kind of mechanization kicks in, they basically won't exist. You also have people, like I think there was a problematic book by Rachel Miller, Beyond Authority and Submission, in which she does affirm that men can only be pastors, or only men can be pastors, and the head of the household, and yet tries to qualify those roles to such an extent that they seem to basically be negligible. And so I think we can see kind of even in the church, we can see kind of pushing towards this idea of let's just have a generic human being and not openly have male and female. At the same time, I think we are presented with the contradictory proposition that the differences between men and women are so great that there cannot be effective communication between the two. This line of reasoning often drives the argument, or the arguments, that corporate boards or other entities, churches, need to have a certain number of women on their leadership roles and things of that nature. To this line of reasoning, I think we need to respond by saying that the Bible clearly teaches that men and women share a human nature and that the Bible has no problem with men representing women. After all, as head of the household, the husband represents his wife at times. The elders can represent all the members of the church, and Christ represents all Christians, both male and female, before the Father. And so I think we have to be careful, on the one hand, not to allow anyone to push us towards this, we just have a generic human being, everything's basically interchangeable, but also not cause the split to be so great that these are basically two separate entities. I think in Genesis, where it says that God created them, male and female, you have this both one thing, they're in the image of God, and that split, male and female. Any questions or comments about this at this point? Yes, I have no problem with that. I suppose. I don't have any objections to that. Okay, the redefinition of marriage. Many have noted that with the Obergefell decision, the United States Supreme Court attempted to radically redefine marriage, and yet I would argue that there have been several, in fact, the more I think about it, I think there are constant attempts to redefine marriage throughout history. Perhaps a never-ending attempt to redefine marriage. The Supreme Court would not have dared to redefine marriage in the way that it did if it had not already allowed it to if society had not already redefined marriage as simply two people having warm, fuzzy feelings towards each other. In this sense, I think the classic movie formula of a wedding and people riding into the sunset can be unhelpful, although I'm not saying that that is immoral, but if that's our picture of marriage, that's a problem. Remember that Genesis 1:28 draws a connection between going forth and multiplying, ruling the earth. Also, if we look at Genesis 2:15, we see God putting the man into the garden to keep and to till it, which seems like a restatement of ruling over the earth. But then, 3 verses later, we see in Genesis 2:18 that God says, "It is not good for the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." And I think this suggests that the man cannot complete his task of ruling over the earth without the woman, since he's incapable of being fruitful and multiplying. Therefore, I think that it's a problem if we try and separate marriage from bearing children. The seventh commandment forbids us from saying that we can basically have marriage, but we don't want to have children. Now, the Bible is certainly aware that sometimes there are marriages that cannot have children. In fact, this problem is a very major theme in the Bible. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel are all unable to have children for a time until God supernaturally intervenes. And these are just a few examples. There are many more. However, these are always viewed as a tragedy, an outworking of the curse. Remember the story where Abimelech takes Sarah? How does it end? In Genesis chapter 20, verses 17 and 18, we are told, "Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and his female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." God punished Abimelech by preventing his entire household from having children, and yet today I think that there are probably many people who would think that's not a punishment at all. Having marriage without children sounds great. And I think there's it shows a very troubling flip of things when marriage is viewed as just two people with warm, fuzzy feelings and not an institution to build a family. I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Paul is quite clear that marriage is not. Yes. Okay. Yes. So Paul is quite clear that there are some people who have the gift to remain single and basically devote their whole lives to serving the Lord, and that is a good and holy calling. And yet I think that that is not, while that is the case, I wouldn't necessarily say that is a better calling, that is a different calling. Yes. Now, I think many in the church, and I'll just talk about this now, many historically in the church, especially, I mean, even now today with the Roman Catholic Church, have argued that marriage is basically a concession. The holy people are going to live celibate lives and not burden themselves with marriage, and that's basically should be what those who are more holy should do, and those who are kind of second tier, well, God gave them marriage because they can't control themselves. I think that's very problematic. Marriage was instituted before the fall, and it is an essential part of the creation mandate. Go forth and multiply is the command we were given. And so, while we do have that category of staying single, I think it is very, very bad to hold that up as what we should be striving towards. And so I think people like Tertullian, Augustine, they just completely blew it. Well, I think it depends. That's a very difficult question to answer. There are some women who will have that calling, some who will not. And I don't want to put pressure on women to try and remain single, thinking this is a more holy calling. I think it is normal to get married, have a family. That's, I guess, statistically speaking, it's much more likely you're going to be in that category. It seems like those who remain single are a kind of a much small, they're there, but they're a smaller subset. Now, I would argue that in doing this and having these kind of categories, they themselves were trying to redefine marriage, whereas the Bible presents it as something good, holy, and proper. Many, even within the church itself, viewed it as something that's kind of a bad concession or unnecessary concession for the weak. And so we can see even there's kind of a redefinition. They did not hold to God's definition, they kind of created their own. And so we can see this can come from many different angles. Another attempt to redefine marriage, I think, which is clearly described in the Bible, comes with polygamy. I think we can say that this goes back to Genesis 4:23, where we see Lamech. Lamech kind of concludes this section on Cain's highly problematic line, and it stops with him, and he kills someone, and he takes 2 wives, and those two seem to be, again, very bad, drawn together. I think that what we can say is that this is another attempt to redefine marriage, whereas God put or created marriage for a man and a woman, trying to add more wives, or in theory more husbands, is changing the definition there. And while it certainly existed among God's people, I think I would say it always creates problems. So you can see Hagar and Sarah, that creates a lot of problems for Abraham. Jacob's having 2 wives creates endless problems for him. Isaac and Rebekah, there's no other woman brought into that relationship, and Isaac and Rebekah, they seem to have a very happy kind of boring, or it's almost boring how smooth that marriage seems to go. Although there is certainly some kind of tensions with Rebekah sneaking around, siding with. There's tensions because of their kids, but that's from a different source. I think David being a polygamist, you have that whole situation with Absalom. It seems like that ends up badly. Solomon, that it's explicitly said because of his many wives, he was led astray. And so I'd say that while polygamy is certainly there, well, polygamy means having more than one wife, specifically. So it is connected to that, but I think the Bible portrays that as being very negative. And kings were expressly forbidden from having multiple wives, and yet they did it anyways. And so we can see just because it's happening in the Old Testament does not mean that there's any blessing given to it. Okay, we have 3 minutes. I think this next section, all of these sections will be much longer than that. Any final questions or comments before I close this in prayer? And I'll leave the rest for you to read at your leisure. Okay, well, let me close this in prayer, and we will conclude. Father, I thank you that you gave us the institution of marriage, and that you clearly defined it for us. I pray that you will strengthen us, help us to love what you have given to us, avoid any attempts to subvert or redefine what you have given to us. Love and defend and cherish it, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.